So now we have the fun part to create the assembly. So to do that, I first need components. I cannot assemble bodies. These have to turn into components. Pretty simple to do. I can start with a single body like this base, right click, and I can say create components from bodies. So there it is. Now this base is considered a component. You can see it moves up part of the browser. It's a main component. Inside of that I have its bodies and origin that belong to that component. That's pretty simple to do. I can do that again for the dal. Right click, create components from bodies. Now the dal is a component. Now this can get a little bit tricky. I can add more than one body to one component. So I'm first going to take this crank attachment and I want to move it so it's part of this crank arm. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to say move copy, and I'm going to move bodies. I'm going to move this body here, so I select that, and the move type I set to point to point. So if I move into this body, I can do point to point, origin point. I'm going to click right here in the middle. That's where it's going to start, and I'm going to move that origin point over to, let's say the bottom of this. See, it draws a line between the two. Over here to that circle, and it moves it right away. And I can say OK. And now that that's moved into place where I want it to be, I can take this arm, right click. You can see it's still its own body. I can create components from bodies. And there's that crank arm. Now I've got this attachment. It's in the right place, but it's still orphaned. It's still its own body. I can drag and drop and add that to the crank arm. When I let go, it's now together. Click on this crank arm and it's got both pieces. And if I open this up, I can see it has two bodies, both the arm and the attachment. And this list could go on. You can add as many bodies as you'd like to a single component. And now this last body here I have left is the handle. I'm going to right click on that. It's going to be just its own component. Right click, create components from bodies. And now I see I have no bodies that are orphaned. They're all part of a component. And now I've got the four components: base, dal, the crank arm, and the handle. Now I can create the assembly. This is where it gets fun. I can come up to assemble, joint, and there's an order to this. It wants component 1 and component 2. Component 1 is the component you want to move, and component 2 is the destination. And by default, you're probably going to see the motion type is rigid, and that's fine. I'm going to pick the first component, and I want to pick it where I want to reference it. If I hover over this, it gives me this little circle as a reference. I can move that anywhere. I just want to orbit to look at the bottom. And if I hover over this big circle, that's going to be my reference point. So I click there. And then where do I want to move this to? It's going to move over to here, to the base. And I want this circle right here to line up with the middle of this circle right here. So I click there. It's going to move it. And by default, that's a rigid motion, but this is a crank arm. It wants to rotate around. So I can change that motion to revolute. I'll see it's going to be able to spin now at that joint. And I can say OK. Now I can do another one of these. So I'm going to go back to assemble, joint. This time I want to start with this crank arm. I don't want to click on the top. I want to click on this attachment down here at the bottom. So I can click here. If that goes inside, maybe I want to click a little bit higher up here. One trick to this, if I have a hard time selecting what I want to, you can hover over the face that you want to select, and if I hold the command on a Mac or control on PC, it's going to jump to these points if I move my mouse around. It's a little trick if you're having a hard time selecting. So I want to select right here, and I want to move that over to the middle point here. And you can see it's going to go right inside there where I want it to be. Now I don't want this to turn, because if this turns and this turns, it's not going to be a good connection. I actually want to make this a rigid connection. So this piece is connected to that piece. It's rigid in that connection. Now last but not least is this handle, And I do want this to spin. I'm just going to do another assemble joint, and I want to pick the first one, which is the handle, and right in the middle here. And that needs to assemble up to here. Now this could stay rigid, it would work, but I want this to spin, so this handle can spin around. A little bit easier to operate. So I can do revolute, I can spin, I can say OK. And now the last thing I need to do to actually make this spin is to lock something in place. Something needs to not move in order for the assembly to work. And so I can go to the base, I can right click on the base, and I can say ground. It puts a little push pin there, and now this is grounded. That cannot move. So if I grab the handle with my mouse, I just click and drag, and now this works. I can see the dowel has a revolute joint, and you can see it right here, this joint with the little flag. That's turning, so it's got a revolute joint. This joint here is rigid, so these two cannot be moved separately, so it's actually pulling. When I turn this crank, it's turning the dowel because of this rigid connection I can see here. And then this handle maintains its position as I move around because of this revolute joint here. So you can see the wood grain, it faces me the whole time as I move this around. And you can see it wiggles a little bit. I can wiggle that as I pull it around and spin it. And there it is. I now have a crank arm assembly.